Some exciting news about my friend down the hall and on the other side of this hour. Today, Rachel Maddow's singular limited series Bagman was named a Peabody nominee. It is a phenomenal piece of work. Big congratulations to that whole team. Goes without saying, if you have not listened to it, you should do yourself a favor and check it out. That is all this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
You can't spring that on me.
What a delightful surprise. It is a fantastic piece of work, and I was very happy to see it recognized.
It means the world coming from you. We are totally flummoxed that it happened. It's very nice. And now you have flummoxed me in the immediate sense by saying it right at the start of the show. Thanks a lot, my friend.
You bet.
Thanks. I wasn't going to bring that up at all. It's very exciting. Let's never speak of it again. Aha. All right. The interview started at 10 a.m. It ended at 2 p.m., so it was a 4-hour thing all in all. They were pretty much almost done. They were well into that final hour when they took one last recess. And then after that last recess, there was one last round of questions. And here's how it started. Quote, "Back on the record. It is 1:37 p.m. I am Suzanne Grooms." The witness, former FBI General Counsel Jim Baker, says yes. Question. Can you explain what the atmosphere was like at the FBI after the president fired James Comey? Answer, Jim Baker. I'm not sure that I can reduce it to one or two words. It was an, I guess, horrible atmosphere. It was shock, dismay, confusion, at least initially that night, and then a sense of resolve that came pretty quickly as well to continue the FBI's mission. And as I was saying earlier to the congressman, make sure that we were all adhering to our oaths to the Constitution and executing our responsibilities. Question. Was there a concern at the FBI that the president had fired Director Comey because he was trying to obstruct the FBI's investigation into the Russia matter? Answer, Jim Baker. Yes. Question. Was that a concern that you had? Answer, Jim Baker. Yes. Question. Was that concern shared by others? Answer. I think so. Yes. Question. Who? Who else? Answer. The leadership of the FBI. So the acting director, I can't remember if we appointed an acting deputy director immediately, the heads of the national security apparatus, the national security folks within the FBI, the people who were aware of the underlying investigation and who had been focused on it. Question, was there discussion about opening a case into the obstruction of justice matter? Answer, I am looking at the FBI, meaning I am looking at the FBI lawyer who was there in that room to see if you have any objection to me answering this question in this format. At which point, Ms. Redacted, the FBI lawyer, says, quote, "Could you restate your question, please?" The investigator says, sure. Was there discussion about opening a case to investigate the obstruction of justice matter? Ms. Redacted, the FBI lawyer, says, okay. So that would call for a yes or no response. If we go further into that, we may have to stop the witness from answering. Answer from Jim Baker, the former FBI General Counsel. He says, yes. So, yes, there was concern by me, by the FBI broadly, by the head of the FBI, by the national security experts within the FBI, by everybody involved in the underlying investigation that involved the president and his campaign at that point. Yes, he says, there were concerns that the president was committing obstruction of justice to try to block the FBI's investigation into the Russia case. And yes, he says, a case was opened into the president's potential obstruction. Yes. The man testifying there was Jim Baker, former general counsel in the FBI. Before he was general counsel, the top lawyer in the FBI, he was a top official at the U.S. Justice Department. During 9/11, he was the head of the Office of Intelligence Policy and Review at the Justice Department, which means that in the aftermath of 9/11, he was the lead official at the U.S. Justice Department for counterterrorism and counterintelligence in the U.S. government. He is a very senior, very experienced, very serious national security official. Today we learned that with that background, Jim Baker and all the other senior national security officials at the FBI were very concerned that the president appeared to be taking action, including firing the FBI director, specifically to obstruct the FBI's investigation into the Russia matter. Now, the reason we know that, the reason we have that Q&A, that transcript, is because the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee in the House released this transcript today of Jim Baker testifying last year to their committee behind closed doors. And I'm not sure why they released this now, why they think this helps their case, that nobody should worry about the Russia thing. I mean, among other things, this transcript they released today includes this very, very, very experienced national security official expressing just how worrying it was what the FBI was investigating and what the FBI was finding out about Donald Trump and his campaign. The questioner here in this part of the transcript is actually a member of Congress. It's Jamie Raskin, Democratic congressman from Maryland. So here's the question from Congressman Raskin, quote, "When you first learned about a tip that the Russian government could be coordinating with the Trump campaign, what was your reaction to that? Were you concerned or alarmed by it?" Answer, Jim Baker. I was alarmed by that, yes. Question, as the evidence developed to the point where the FBI actually launched an official investigation, did your thinking change? Had you grown more alarmed and concerned, or less so? Answer, Jim Baker. I guess I grew more alarmed over time. Question, how often does the FBI investigate a potential coordination between a presidential campaign in our country and a foreign adversary? Is that a common thing? Answer, Jim Baker. I think this is the first instance that I'm aware of. Question, and what was your estimate of the national security risk involved in such potential coordination? How important was the case? Answer, Jim Baker. I viewed the case as very important. So he's saying this was a very important case in national security terms. Nothing like this had ever happened before, had ever even been investigated before, involving an American presidential campaign. He said what the FBI was investigating was concerning from the get-go, from the very beginning. It only became more concerning over time as they pursued their investigation. And when the FBI director was fired by the president in the midst of that FBI investigation, there was serious concern among the most senior national security officials in the country that the president was doing that to obstruct, to use his power as president to block that very serious FBI investigation. And we know that now because this transcript was just released today. It is now, it was 3 Fridays ago that Special Counsel Robert Mueller submitted his report on the findings of his investigation into the Russian attack on our election, potential American complicity in that attack, and the question of whether or not anybody tried to obstruct that investigation. On this issue of obstruction, Attorney General William Barr so far hasn't released anything from Mueller's report, Mueller's evidence, Mueller's findings, except this description. After making a thorough factual investigation into these matters, the special counsel considered whether to evaluate the conduct under department standards governing prosecution and declination decisions, but ultimately determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment. The special counsel therefore did not draw a conclusion one way or the other as to whether the examined conduct constituted obstruction. The special counsel states that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. That's all the Attorney General released on the obstruction issue. We don't know what Robert Mueller found on obstruction. We don't know what the facts were that he uncovered. We don't know why what Mueller found doesn't exonerate the president, in Mueller's words. Nor do we know why Mueller didn't make a traditional prosecutorial judgment about obstruction. I mean, that's all the more striking and interesting in light of this news we just got today about how freaked out the whole national security law enforcement apparatus in this country was about the president potentially obstructing the Russia investigation by, among other things, canning the head of the FBI. I mean, we do know that Barr, 2.5 weeks ago, jumped right in himself anyway and proclaimed his own instant finding that the president definitely shouldn't be prosecuted for obstruction, and we should take his word for it, even though he won't let us see what Mueller turned up. That announcement was 2.5 weeks ago from the Attorney General. Today was Attorney General William Barr's first public appearance since he made that very, very public, very controversial, very puzzling declaration. First time since then. First time since he got the Mueller report. First time since he's done all this stuff that he's done with the Mueller report. Finally, today, with him appearing in public, with him appearing in Congress, we knew we would get some explanation from him as to why he declared that the president definitely didn't commit a crime. We'd finally get some explanation from him as to what basis he used to, on what basis he concluded that the president didn't commit a crime. Also, presumably, we'd get some explanation from him as to why he thought it was his job to proclaim that the president didn't commit any crime. At least you'd think we would have gotten that today in his first appearance since the Mueller report was handed in to him and he stuffed it deep into a desk drawer somewhere. You'd think we'd get answers to all of those questions, but it turns out nobody asked him at his appearance today in Congress. Nobody asked him about his declaration that the president didn't commit a crime when it comes to obstruction. At least nobody asked him directly. Nobody asked him directly in a way that made him feel any need to answer. Senators will have another crack at William Barr tomorrow when he does one more congressional appearance before part of the Senate Appropriations Committee. But if you're at all interested in the question of whether Mueller's findings are ever going to see the light of day, or whether the Trump administration will be allowed to keep those findings secret, you better hope that senators, at least the Democratic ones who appear to care about this issue, you'd better hope that those senators are preparing for tomorrow's hearing with William Barr with some seriousness. Senators, it's called a follow-up question. Listen to what he says and then follow up and press him a little more. It's called knowing what your colleagues are planning on asking so you don't all ask the same thing. It's called taking your no-dose pills with your OJ, senators. Come on, chop, chop. Because there does appear to be a lot to get out of this attorney general, and this attorney general really does appear to be just making it up as he goes along. Even today, under basically no inquisitive pressure whatsoever today from a committee that appeared to be mostly asleep for the entire time he was there, even with him facing basically no hard questions today, he still had a lot to spill. I mean, imagine what would happen if he were actually pressed.
I have already said that I think the situation here requires me to exercise my discretion to get as much information out as I can. And I think these categories, I think most fair-minded people would agree, are things that have to be redacted.
Right. And I guess just thinking about the chairman of Judiciary, if he were to release, or any member of Congress were to release the full report or redacted portions of the report, are they in compliance with law or in violation of the law? And
I don't want to speculate about all the circumstances that would be involved. I don't intend this at this stage to send the full unredacted report to the committee. So I'm not sure where he would get it.
Okay, and then just
if he got it directly from the council, that would be unfortunate. I doubt that would happen.
Maybe he'd get it directly from the council. That'd be unfortunate. What? That was the Attorney General today under gentle, almost soporific questioning from a Republican member of Congress who was trying to get him to say that it would be terrible if someone in Congress got a hold of the whole unredacted Mueller report and leaked it to the public, or leaked the parts that were supposed to be redacted by the Attorney General. In response, the Attorney General suggested, wait, how would a member of Congress, how would the Judiciary Committee say, get an unredacted copy of Mueller's report? He then sort of fantasizes, sort of just thinks out loud, well, I suppose he could get it directly from Robert Mueller. He could get the whole unredacted report directly from the special counsel. I guess he could do that. That would be unfortunate. Say what now? Whoop! Raise your hand if you even knew that was a possibility. Unfortunately or not. I mean, the Attorney General sort of accidentally suggesting today that, Robert Mueller could give his confidential report to the Justice Department. He could also just convey it to Congress. Why not? He could just give it to Jerry Nadler. That would be unfortunate if he gave him the whole, full, unredacted report. Wouldn't that be just, sad? Maybe somebody could follow up on that with additional questions for the Attorney General. Is that possible? The Attorney General today said his edited version of Mueller's report, with a whole bunch of redactions cut out of it, he said that will be released within a week. He said flatly that he has no intention of giving the Congress the full report without the cuts. When it comes to what he wants to cut out of it, he said he will cut out grand jury material. Even though courts in the past have agreed to allow the release of grand jury material to Congress, he said today he's not going to ask any court to do that. He just doesn't want to ask.
Are you intending to go to court to ask for guidance and or direction and or an order where you are uncertain whether you can in fact release or should in fact release materials?
Well, but I mean, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee is free to go to court if he feels one of those exceptions is applicable.
The right is yours to ask for these exceptions.
Why do you say the right is mine?
Because you are the exercising authority under 6E.
Yeah, but I think if the chairman believes that he's entitled to receive it, he can move the court for it.
Well, I'll come back to this. It's your right to ask. So I'm asking, what is your intention?
My intention is not to ask for it at this stage.
I'm not going to ask for it. The Attorney General says no, he's not going to ask a court to allow him to release the grand jury material in Mueller's report to Congress. Why would I do that? This is the first time he's actually addressed that question. He has left that as an open question since the Judiciary Committee has been demanding that he make that request of a court. Today he said, nah, why would I do that? It earned this response from Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler.
The Attorney General said in pretty much no uncertain terms today that he had no intentions of going to the court to release the grand jury information to Congress and punted to you on that front. What do you think about that stance?
Well, I think it's unfortunate. We've been doing everything we could for the last, several weeks and weeks to try to reach an accommodation with the Attorney General under which we would see the report and the underlying evidence. He has been unresponsive to our requests, and this is just more evidence that he's stated he's not going to. I mean, we will certainly. We get the report, I assume, at the end of this week, being next week. Yeah. If it doesn't have everything that we require to do our work, which is to say the entire report and the underlying evidence in it, we will issue subpoenas forthwith, and we will have to we will go to court to ask for a release of the 6E material. Now, it's unfortunate that he won't join us. Previous attorney generals have joined the Congress in that request in every similar case.
What do you make of Barr's specific contention that Congress is not exempt from grand jury secrecy laws?
Well, Congress is not exempt in the sense that we need a court order, but Congress has certainly gotten that court order in every similar situation in the past. Congress has always gotten the grand jury information in the Clinton situation, in the Nixon situation, and in many others.
Barr seems to put the ball in your court in terms of asking for the grand jury information. Is that something you would do?
Oh, absolutely, we're going to do that.
Oh, absolutely we're going to do that, even though the Attorney General will not join us in trying to free that information up. As soon as William Barr, the Attorney General, hands over his cut-up, edited Jefferson Bible version of the report, Chairman Nadler of the Judiciary Committee says he's going to subpoena the whole thing, the whole unredacted version, including asking for a court order to release any grand jury information that Barr has cut out of it, plus all the underlying evidence that goes along with it. Now, there's two new things we've just learned about that. Number one, William Barr's refusal to ask the court to release that material to Congress, and Nadler saying, okay, then we'll do it, it raises a brand new prospect that we have not had to face before. It raises the prospect that one of the things that the House Judiciary Committee might have to do is they might have to open an impeachment inquiry into President Trump as a formal matter. So the court would recognize them as being in the midst of a judicial proceeding that could legally receive that grand jury stuff. They would not have to open this grand jury proceeding because they're intent on impeaching the president They would not have to open this impeachment proceeding because they're intent on impeaching the president right now. They would have to open it up just so they could receive that material from the court. Democrats, of course, have not wanted to open impeachment proceedings against President Trump, basically for political reasons. But it's possible they might need to now if they want a court to give them Mueller's evidence, since the Attorney General won't help them get it. That is, of course, provided that Robert Mueller himself doesn't just walk his report over to Capitol Hill and hand it to Jerry Nadler, which the Attorney General suggested today is an unfortunate possibility, even if it's one that nobody knew of before he kind of smirked that out today casually. Provided that doesn't happen, this new idea that House Democrats might have to formally open an impeachment inquiry into Trump in order to get the report, that is a brand new twist in this saga. It has legal elements. It has political elements. We're going to get some expert advice on that in just a moment. But the other curveball that Barr threw today, and this is something we just don't have a way to check, and it doesn't seem to make much sense on its face the way he said it, but it is what he said. The other curveball Barr threw today has to do with the 4 categories of things that Barr says he's now cutting out of the Mueller report. Remember, he said he's cutting not just the grand jury information, which is the thing they have to go to court to try to get an order to release that information. He says he's also cutting information that could impact ongoing investigations. He says he's also cutting information that could impact the privacy or the reputations of peripheral third parties. And he says he's cutting information that the intelligence community wants cut out for its own reasons. That list of 4 categories of information, that That stuff that all has to be cut out of Robert Mueller's report before any of Mueller's report gets shown to Congress. That is something that appeared like fully formed in the sky as if it were a rainbow ending in the Attorney General's head. You know, this list of stuff that has to be cut out of the report, it's not from the special counsel regulations. This is like a miracle of spring. This isn't even the initial list of things that Attorney General Barr said he'd cut. It's just now what he says he is currently doing. And we're supposed to assume there's a quasi-legal framework under which he's made the decisions that this is what he has to cut, but we take his word for it. Today, though, check this out. He said when it comes to making all of these different categories of cuts, he said in the first 3 of those 4 categories, it's Robert Mueller. It's the special counsel's office that's choosing what gets cut. Really? Choosing what gets cut out of their own report. Really? At least that is what the Attorney General seemed to suggest today under questioning from Hawaii Congressman Ed Case. Questioning, I should say, that seemed to unnerve the Attorney General just a little bit.
I've already explained the information that's going to be redacted from the report, the 4 categories. That is what's going to govern the redactions. And in fact, the special counsel and his staff are helping us select the information in the report that falls into those 4 categories.
We're sitting here, from my perspective, with virtually unlimited discretion for you to redact from that document. And maybe if I trusted my government more, I would be comfortable with that. But since I don't, I'm not comfortable with that. And I'm looking for some way in which your judgment, which is going to be the arbiter, as I understand it, of what the public sees, the arbiter, it's you, ultimately, can be overseen. I've suggested to you that under 6E, there are procedures under which you can go to court to ask the court to give you guidance, direction, or an order. I'm not sure whether you will do that or not.
Well, I think I sort of addressed that. I identified the 4 categories, and the team that includes the special counsel office lawyers are implementing that.
Can you?
So, you know, they are the ones redacting what is 6E. They're the ones who conducted the investigation. They know what is 6E and what is not 6E. That's why I'm dependent on the special counsel to identify 6E. And the intelligence community will identify the intelligence stuff. And the lawyers who were prosecuting the cases and the special counsel's office can identify whether there's going to be a conflict between releasing any information and a court order or an ongoing prosecution. And the special counsel's office knows who the peripheral players are that they've said shouldn't be charged. So those are the categories.
Does this mean we're getting 6E back? I mean, when he says those, put that list back up again. Put the list back. Okay, 6E is the grand jury information. So he's redacting 6E stuff. That's the grand jury material. And he's redacting information that impacts ongoing investigation. And he's redacting information about peripheral third parties and stuff that the intelligence community wants out. He said in Congress today that the first 3 categories of those redactions are all being decided by Robert Mueller, by the special counsel's office. He says he's dependent on them to determine what's grand jury, what's 6E, what relates to ongoing matters, and what relates to peripheral third parties. Well, if so, if this is Mueller clearing his own report for release to Congress and ultimately for release to the public, then why would Mueller's team be so mad about what's getting cut out of their report if they, in fact, are the ones in charge of doing the cutting? I mean, something there just doesn't make sense. I mean, something maybe the senators questioning William Barr tomorrow might want to nail down. And quick, because this is all apparently happening now. And there's another piece of it that just unexpectedly broke wide open tonight. And we've got that coming up. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.